Hi, welcome back. So last time we talked about how the slave trade, how slavery took hold in Virginia, and how the colonies moved away from indentured servitude and evolved toward a society based in slavery and racial hierarchy. And so today I'd like to consider the experience of Africans in this process. How did the opening of the Atlantic world change Africa? How did it influence the development of Africa along with the Americas and Europe? What was it like to live in societies where slavery was not only encouraged, but considered a part of everyday life? And of course, what was it like for ordinary Africans who are swept up in this process? And so I'd like to start with a graphic that illustrates in about 2 minutes time the journey of slaves across the Atlantic. And so I used to be able to blow this up, but I'm not sure that I can anymore. And what you see here is an animated map, and you should start to see dots going across the screen. And each one of those dots represents a slave ship carrying its cargo to the Americas. The bigger the dot, the more slaves on board. And so you can see here this GIF, this animated map, started out in the mid 1500s very slowly, but here we are about 100 years later, and you can see that we're already seeing an increase in the number of slave ships traveling across the Atlantic. Most of them coming, of course, from West Africa, in this area, but not all of them. Some farther south, some farther north, even the rare ship from the east coast of Africa. And if we notice their destination, most of them, the overwhelming majority of them, are headed to Brazil, and often to the Caribbean here. And we do see some, of course, heading to North America. But here, as you see, we're now in the 1700s. The pace of slave cargoes heading to the Americas has increased rapidly, and now we're entering into probably the most intense period of the slave trade. And you can just see here how many dots are flying across the screen. And again, each one of those dots represents a ship, and anywhere from, dozens of slaves on board to hundreds. And so here we are now in the era of the American Revolution, starting to slow down a little bit, but when the revolution ends, picking up again, lots of slaves heading to Hispaniola here, the Dominican Republic, what we would call the Dominican Republic, and Haiti today. And I want you to notice a change here. By the time we get to about 1809, you'll still see slave ships heading to North America now. In fact, they're kind of increasing, but once we get to 1809, they pretty much stop. There still might be a random ship. You see a couple who are coming to the United States. It's, of course, the United States at this point, not a British colony anymore. And that's because the United States outlawed the slave trade in 1809, made it illegal to bring in more slaves from Africa. That did not mean that the slaves who were already in the United States would have anything done to alter their condition. But what it meant was that no more slaves could be imported. And so there were some who certainly broke the law, but for the most part, that put an end to the trade in the United States. And so I think that illustrates just the amount of, the sheer amount of slaves coming to the Americas. If we think about the lives and the logistics behind the dots, from the investors in Europe who put up the money on these very, very risky ventures, to the sailors who worked on board the ships, to, of course, the Africans themselves. And nobody knows how many Africans were taken from their homeland and shipped across the Atlantic Ocean, but a group of historians has done their best and come up with a number by combing through countless logs and manifests, visiting archives, and to the best of our knowledge, between about 1501 and 1866, something like 12.5 million slaves left Africa, or Africans, I guess we should say at this point. Of that number, about 10.7 million disembarked from the ships that they were carried on. That means that we had almost 2 million who didn't make it for some reason or another. And we'll talk about it later, but you can see here in this particular drawing, which was a primary source that shows a diagram of a slave ship, that slaves were, of course, crowded together and kept in utterly deplorable conditions. So the largest carriers of slaves were far and away the Portuguese. They were the ones who started first, and they were the ones who finished last. They carried something alone. This tiny country of Portugal, but I guess we could also say Brazil later on, carried something like 5.8 million people to Brazil. That's about 47% of all slaves. About 3.2 million went to the British West Indies and British North America. And the British were, in terms of numbers, the second most involved in the slave trade, carrying something, like 3.2 million compared to the Portuguese 5.8 million. But there's other players too. The French to some extent, of course, the Spanish, the Dutch, even Denmark was involved for a time in the slave trade. And so the United States, of course, although it came to benefit from slavery, since it wasn't a country until very late in this process, right? We're not a country till 1776. The slave trade has already been going on for 2.5 centuries at that point. The United States was only responsible for bringing about 305,000 Africans out of Africa and disembarking about 250,000 in the United States. And so what we need to keep in mind here is this is the largest transoceanic forced migration in history. And that is saying something, right? This is a massive migration of people, but they're being brought against their will. And I'm going to give you a statistic that I kind of marvel at a little bit, even having known this for quite a while. We like to think of the Americas as a place of opportunity for its immigrants, but most of the people who were brought here were brought against their will. Something like 6 out of 7 people who crossed the Atlantic before the American Revolution were African slaves. Before 1820, about 4 Africans arrived in the Americas for every single European. So this is a large number of people, and they're being brought here, again, not by choice, not to make a better life for themselves, but in fact, to make a better life for somebody else in a lot of cases. And so slavery itself is a very old institution. It goes back to the dawn of civilization. If you read the Bible and the Old Testament, you'll find that slavery existed then. It flourished in Greece and Rome, the Middle East, early modern Russia. But in all of those places, something was different about slavery as opposed to the slavery that evolves after the opening of the Atlantic world, and that is the fact that in all of those places, slavery had nothing to do with skin color. Slavery had existed in Africa for centuries as well. Slavery often involved personal service, often for a limited time. Starving children could be sold into slavery. If you were a debtor or a criminal, you might serve time as a slave. But slaves still had rights. They could marry, they could have kids, they had certain protections under the law. But Europeans are driven by a need for labor. due in some part to a declining Native American population. Who is going to work in those mines in South America, silver mines, for instance? Who is going to work on the sugar plantations in the Caribbean? Who is going to pick tobacco? All of these entities, all of these resources are labor intensive. You need workers for them. And European workers are not always willing to volunteer for such arduous labor. So sugar, for instance, very costly, very exotic when, prior to Columbus arriving in the Americas. But Portugal begins using slave labor on the island of Madeira, and this changes the institution fundamentally. Almost all of those people end up being slaves for life. And by the time we get to the American Revolution, only 1% of blacks had actually become free. And again, if you remember what we talked about before, we saw that early on in Virginia, slavery had not yet hardened into this institution with rigid rules, and there were paths to freedom for some early slaves or servants. But after a while, those loopholes are closed, and slavery becomes an institution defined by color, and that exists overwhelmingly in the southern colonies of North America. But of course, it can be found in every region. And so people become commodities here, right? We're putting a price tag on human beings. And the rise of global capitalism at this point depends upon slavery. Without slavery, there's no sugar on the table of Europeans. There's no cheap tobacco or cheap cotton. And to us today, this seems like a very backward, anti-modern, barbaric institution. But keep in mind, at the time, the most advanced economic systems, the most prosperous societies of the time relied upon slavery. It requires logistics, it requires business savvy and wealth to make it work. And often one tends to think of Europeans as being the sole force behind the slave trade. And while they were certainly the primary drivers, they could not have achieved success without the aid of Africans. Slaves were almost always, I guess we should say slavers, meaning the Europeans who bring their slave ships and dock off the coast of Africa. They almost always buy their slaves from African middlemen, leading merchants and chiefs of these coastal kingdoms. And African kings are not duped here. The Europeans are paying top dollar. The Africans are exacting a very substantial price for the slaves that they're turning over. They're trading manufactured goods as well as cloth and tea. The tea having made its way from India already, perhaps. And these African chiefs, they drive a hard bargain, too. If you're going to pay in currency, we're talking about 17 to 20 pounds sterling. That was the going rate for a slave, and that would be about $4,000 per slave today. They also provided guns, something like 300,000 guns per year exported to West Africa. But the demand is going to change the process here. At first, Africans are all too willing to turn over their criminals and outsiders, the people that perhaps they've captured in wars. But now what we tend to see is wars or raids that are conducted in the name of capturing more slaves. And of course, this decimates African societies. And we can think of this, in some ways as a choice, right? Even if Africans weren't always on board with participating, they might have felt compelled to engage in it anyways. The thought being that if your neighboring kingdom does participate and you don't, and they receive state-of-the-art weaponry, that you might find yourself enslaved next. So in some ways, this is a case of enslave or be enslaved, to be sure. And so this is a choice that some African kingdoms are making on the coast. And so once slaves are rounded up, Africans are captured in the interior, they're marched to the coast. Many of them have never seen the coast, they've never seen the ocean before. And once there, they're put on these massive slave ships and taken on what becomes known as the Middle Passage. And so we saw, if you did some of the reading for last week, you saw how bad it was for indentured servants to make this journey across the Atlantic Ocean. But for slaves, it is infinitely worse. This is a voyage that can last months. It depends to some extent on the winds. You might, if you're lucky, cover the 4,000 miles in 3 weeks to a month. But if you run into the doldrums or some dead air, you could have ships that were stranded for weeks, and this forces captains aboard those ships to make hard choices, to throw slaves overboard to conserve food and water supply. And of course, treatment on these ships was very brutal. Slaves could be branded as a way to be marked. Suicide was common. Revolt was common. And again, these are people who have no idea what's in store for them. Some of them think they're being fattened up to be eaten. They're being held in chains in these horrible conditions below deck. They're being disciplined and controlled, and they're being deliberately placed with other men from different tribes in order to prevent them from communicating and to avoid revolt. Early on, especially, slavers were more interested in men than women. They were more valuable for the grueling labor that they were expected to do, particularly in the Caribbean. They were inspected for health. They were forced to eat. And if they chose not to eat, there were tools that would pry their mouths open. And so, obviously, these slave traders have an interest in getting their cargo across the Atlantic alive, but they're also interested in making a profit. Like I said earlier, food is running out. Perhaps the best choice is to dispose of some slaves early on. If there's signs of disease, you want to kind of call the infected slaves before they infect everybody else. And there is some research to this point that suggests that sharks actually became accustomed to following slave ships across the Atlantic. These ships were always throwing waste overboard, and when slaves died, they were throwing bodies overboard as well. And so this was, part of, the absolute horror of these journeys. These captains did their best to keep the slaves in a state of fear. And, of course, ship revolts were somewhat common. There is a lot at stake here, but some research actually suggests that something like 1 in 10 slave voyages was affected by violence. And so usually these revolts are unsuccessful. They're usually put down with great force, but some of them are successful. Occasionally, Africans force slave ships to turn around, to go back to Africa. Sometimes the ships are destroyed in the middle of the ocean. But this does make a difference, right? We we want to think about the idea of agency here again. Did slaves have any ability to influence their outcome, to influence their conditions? And I think, one thing we could say is if Africans had been more docile, then perhaps many, many more people would have been enslaved, because some research suggests because these revolts, this violence on these ships was so common, that these ships had to be staffed appropriately. They had to have a sufficient number of sailors on board, well armed, to put down rebellions. And so that's going to reduce the number of, journeys you're going to make across the Atlantic. You need to have more manpower per ship, then you're going to have fewer ships. And so some people suggest that, if these slaves had been more docile, then maybe 1 million more people might have been shipped across the Atlantic. So in other words, even if they were not successful in securing their own freedom, perhaps they prevented somebody else from being enslaved. And so here's just a quick map that sort of, again, sums up where most slaves were going. The bigger the circle, the more slaves who were disembarked in those areas. So the West Indies was a primary location. The Caribbean, Barbados, these are British colonies, Jamaica. And this is a very, very grueling place. And again, these people are working on sugar plantations. Sugar plantations are very profitable for their owners, but they're really deadly for slaves. It's a very brutal work regimen, hard work, tropical diseases. And there's been some studies to suggest that 1 in 3 Caribbean slaves in the 18th century would have died within about 3 years of their arrival in a place like Barbados. And also, we see an extremely low birth rate due to nutritional deficiencies. These slaves worked hard. They probably didn't get enough to eat. They didn't get all the nutrients they needed. And so as a result, the birth rate is extremely low. Probably about 1 in 4 babies died within 10 days of their birth. And so what this means is that this is a place where you've got to continually replenish slaves. You've got to continually bring more slaves from Africa, because this is not a population that's self-sustaining. North America, on the other hand, is different. Births there exceed deaths, so there is a natural population growth there. And so let's talk finally then about consequences here. How is it, what are the big consequences here? Well, I'm going to start with how this affects Africa, of course. And so Africa is devastated by this. We can think of, again, we're talking about maybe 10 or 12 million people leaving the continent. And so what the continent is ultimately faced with is demographic loss. The population actually declines in West Africa. Now, think about what's going on in Europe at this point. Again, they're benefiting from having corn and potatoes added to their diet. The population is rapidly expanding there. Africa, on the other hand, sees a net decline in its population between 1700 and 1800. There were probably about 25 million people in West Africa, in particular, in 1700. By 1800, it's only 20 million. And so this, of course, is going to hamper development. You're losing people, your population is sinking, and of course, this has real consequences for the development of economies and societies and governments, to be sure. And of course, African society itself is changing too. No longer do we see sort of revered traditional culture in a lot of cases, especially on these coastal kingdoms. We see, a newfound sort of fascination, or I think we could say greed, for wealth that can come with the capturing and the selling of slaves. And so, who benefits from this arrangement? Well, that's a interesting question, right? It's certainly not Africans. There's maybe a handful, again, people in the coastal kingdoms, elites who are trafficking in slaves, who may be enriching themselves. But even if we consider Europeans, we could say, some people might be tempted to say, oh, well, the Europeans benefited. Well, this is true, of course, but not every European benefits either. Most of the sailors on slave ships didn't prosper. This was dangerous, dangerous work. Seamen were poorly paid. They could succumb to illness just like slaves did. Again, violent outbreaks. And it seems like being a seaman on one of these ships often led to a very short life. Now, the big difference we can say is these people had a choice, as opposed to the African slaves who were brought on board these ships. But we have to think about what their lives were like, that was what they thought was their best choice, right? I mean, this is still, again, they have a choice. Africans don't. But they were probably faced with some pretty grim choices on their own. And so if anybody is actually prospering here, it's the people who are investing money. It's the captains of ships. It's banks who are lending money. It's insurance companies who are insuring these voyages across the Atlantic. It's the plantation owner, perhaps first and foremost, who's amassing fabulous wealth. Again, probably particularly in sugar at this time, but there'll be other resources later. Fabulous wealth off the backs of slaves. And then something else we have to consider too is the average consumer is benefiting as well. So sugar at this time moves from being something that's exotic and very pricey to something that comes within reach of the average worker in England or in the Americas. You take sugar with your coffee or with your tea. All but perhaps the very, very poorest people would have access to sugar at least sometimes. We could say the same thing about tobacco or rice, or certainly cotton a little bit later, and the idea of making cheap clothing from cotton. So farmers in the Pennsylvania backcountry, workers in New York City, citizens of London and Philadelphia, they may not have a direct hand in enslaving people, but they're using the products that were derived from their bondage, and in some ways we could say that they're actually, perpetuating this institution. So there's several points removed. Obviously, some people are aware of this. There are some people who eventually say, you know what, I'm not going to have sugar on my table. But there's other people who don't really reflect on it or think about it or all. And then another thing that we can say is rebellion. Slaves are going to rebel. We'll talk about this a bit later in the semester. Certainly in places like Brazil, Jamaica, there are constant rebellions. There's lots of bloody revolts, people killed on both sides. In the Americas, not as much. In North America, not as much. In the United States, not as much. There are some instances, and we'll talk about those instances, but not as much at this point. And we start to see a change moving from African culture to African American culture. You have these disparate cultures that are uniting on the ship. They're uniting more when they get to their place of disembarkation, whether that is Jamaica or South Carolina or Georgia. And we're seeing elements of African culture mixed then with American culture, and something that emerges that is distinctly African American at this point. And so, are there voices against slavery? Yes, there are voices that are going to come out against slavery. And as we'll see in the United States, this is going to become a particularly thorny problem. A people that comes to depend on slavery economically and socially, we can't forget, are doing so even as they begin to proclaim their belief in natural rights, right? The idea that they need to be, that government needs to be consented to. And of course, the idea as well that all men are created equal. And so this is somewhat paradoxical when it comes to reconciling this with slavery. So that is something that as we get closer to the time of the American Revolution, we're going to have to consider. But for now, we're going to stop, and there'll be one more lecture that kind of deals with this first part of the course and the opening of the Atlantic world, and I will post that in a couple of days. So hope all is well with you, and I will talk with you again soon. Take care.